This is Ziad alive from the north of Gaza. Since December 2023, I've been displaced in a Tarj neighborhood after my home was destroyed by the Israeli military. You can now hear the continuous artillery shelling hitting Gaza City and northern Gaza. Continuous violent artillery shelling and 16 air warplanes strikes continues to hit Gaza City and the northern governorates of Gaza Strip following the siege and military operations, especially in Jabalia. The crisis deepens and deepens more. Civilians are trapped, besieged, and constantly at risk of being killed.
Ziad Musa is one of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living through some of the most difficult days since Israel's war in Gaza began over a year ago. For weeks now, the Israeli military has isolated the north of the Strip, conducting airstrikes and ground attacks, including on residential areas and hospitals. Last week, Hamas leader and one of Israel's most wanted, Yahya Sinwar, was killed. So why is Israel still in northern Gaza? And why can't aid groups get in? In back-to-back attacks on Beit Lahia and the nearby Jabalia refugee camp, more than 100 people were killed over the span of a single day. Bodies line the streets of Jabalia as ambulances continue to be blocked from entering. Gazans have been calling the north a mass grave. Ziad works with the UN Human Rights Office to manage data collection on the ground. He paints a picture of a struggle for survival.
People here face harsh and unimaginable humanitarian conditions. Most displaced families escaped with just clothes on their backs. Almost every family lacks essential supplies like blankets, mattresses, hygiene items, clothing, and sanitary pads, especially for women and girls. People are sleeping on the ground in this harsh cold weather as the winter is coming. They are taking shelters in damaged buildings, burnt out shops, football fields. I met some families who are literally living in a bathroom. These conditions are not just challenging. I just can call them degrading and inhumane.
The impossible conditions Ziad describes are compounded by the obstacles that aid workers, medical staff, and rescue teams have to face.
2 out of 3 hospitals in the north are either shut down or barely functioning. The international and UN efforts to enter have been denied. Even the civil defense has been blocked from rescuing the injured or retrieving the bodies of martyrs. Access to aid remains under the mercy of the Israeli military, whether to allow it in or not, and most probably will not. People barely can get 1 meal a day. The Israeli military is using these needs as a weapon.
More forced displacement orders have been issued for families of the north. But where will they go? And if they stay, what will be their fate? UN officials and other rights groups have warned that Israel is forcing Gazan residents to choose between leaving or starving.
Despite this violence, people are still refusing to leave, unless forced by direct threats, as they believe leaving means never coming back, just like those who were displaced to the southern Gaza. This leaves them with a single option. We are here, waiting to get killed.
This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we look at what Israel says its military goals in Gaza are, especially after Sinwar's killing. And we question what Israel plans on doing in Gaza after it decides to end its campaign.
It's unlikely that the assassination of Yahya Sinwar will stop the war. Israel is not interested in just killing Sinwar. It wants to finish off Palestine, finish off Gaza, finish off the people.
Of course, the war won't stop at all, because this is just an excuse for them. Their end goal is to exterminate the people. They don't want the war to end at all.
The war will not end until all the Israeli hostages are released. And look what's happening now. The fighting in northern Gaza is intensifying. What end to the war?
These voices from the heart of Gaza paint a bleak picture. The war will not end. For them, media jargon and press conferences about the, quote, beginning of the end of the war ring hollow. For over a year, they have had their hopes destroyed again and again, with every failed prospect of a ceasefire. Some believed for a while that their plight was taken seriously, but as time passes, and more than 42,000 Palestinians killed and counting, we are being increasingly told that Gazans see no point in speaking out anymore, because it's become clear to them that nobody is coming to save them, and that nobody is standing in the way of inevitable death. Not even the assassination of Hamas's top leader, Yahya Sinwar, the supposed orchestrator of the October 7 attacks. Now that he's gone, who will fill his shoes? What will become of Hamas? And what does it mean for Gaza, where the war rages on in some of the deadliest days for Palestinians since the start of the war? I speak about this with Tahani Mustafa, senior Palestine analyst at the Crisis Group. Tahani, after Sinwar's killing, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that this is the beginning of the end of the war. We believed for a while that when Israel kills Hamas leaders that they'd declare Gaza safe and effectively end the war there. But since then, we've seen one of the most violent assaults on northern Gaza that started almost 3 weeks ago. A siege, starvation, killing, and hospital attacks. So which is it? Is the war ending or getting worse?
Well, I mean, look, the circumstantial evidence is indicative that Israel has no intention of ending this war immediately. When Netanyahu says this is the beginning of the end, I think what he's trying to get at is that he has reached or concluded one of Israel's prime military objectives, which is to kill who they had claimed was the mastermind of October the 7th. What that actually means within the sort of Israeli narrative of how they kind of envision this campaign ending is very different to how I think many of us would understand that to be, which is Israel does not envision a permanent ceasefire. It does not envision a kind of day after in the sense of an end to the fighting, the reconstruction of Gaza, the withdrawal of Israeli troops. For Israel, it ultimately is about ensuring that it has the reoccupation ground troops. I mean, we're talking about on the ground, a reoccupation of Gaza on the ground, alongside ensuring that Gaza will never be in a situation to ever threaten Israel's sense of security again, which means that we can never anticipate having any sort of viable administrative entity that's going to govern Gaza. What we are seeing today is ultimately how Israel envisions the reality for Gaza for a very long time, which is a tent city in the ruins, Gaza dependent on humanitarian aid for everything, the continued displacement of people, the absence of any sense of permanency on that land. And we've seen no improvement in terms of the humanitarian condition. More aid has not been let through. We've seen no scaling back of Israel's aerial bombardment or besiegement of the north, as well as what we're now seeing also in the south. It's not like the south is faring any better here. Israel has continued to expand its war in Lebanon to the extent where Hamas is now reluctant to name its next successor on the basis of security concerns. So it is very indicative that this had nothing to do with Sinwar. We're not any closer to a ceasefire despite all the noise around a ceasefire. So I don't think this really does make a significant difference in the broader scheme of things. This doesn't shift the Israeli position, and it certainly hasn't shifted the international attitude towards Israel.
The dramatic end to Sinwar, believed to be the orchestrator of the October 7 attacks, was shared in a video by the Israeli army. It was a victorious moment for Israel, but people have also said it showed Sinwar as a man who fought till his death, and not in a tunnel or hiding behind civilians. We've spoken to Gazans, many who have expressed increasing anger towards Hamas. How do you think Sinwar's killing will affect Hamas as a group and public opinion towards it inside of Gaza?
Sinwar's killing doesn't affect Hamas in any substantial way. Definitely symbolically, it was a huge hit to the movement. But in terms of the actual operational capability of the movement, I mean, Hamas is not a centralized organization that's dependent on particular figures, as much as Western media and the Israelis like to make out as though Palestinian politics is so centered on figures. That's not the case at all. And it's interesting because Israel's release of the video actually had the complete adverse effect, not just amongst Palestinians, but even Western audiences. You know, it humanized Sinwar, but more importantly, it humanized Palestinian resistance, right? Now, this came against the backdrop of where Hamas was losing significant political support amongst Palestinians. In the last 6 months, their support has dropped, not just in Gaza, but also the West Bank. This also came against the backdrop of a time where even Sinwar's popularity, he was actually seeing a bit of a spike. Now, this could actually end up having, again, the adverse effect, where you could now see a spike of support for Hamas, not just in terms of its leadership, but in terms of the movement more broadly, especially at a time where it is able to recruit more and more on the ground. in terms of human resources, it's seen something like an 80% increase in terms of its recruitment. If Israel was trying to sort of, again, deter Palestinian resistance and sort of conduct a smear campaign here, I think it's had the complete adverse effect.
US and European officials, including French President Macron and US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, have called the killing of Sinwar an opportunity for the war in Gaza to end. Do you believe at this point that any diplomatic pressure can change the path forward on Israel's side?
Yes, I mean, it's a bit of a distortion from Western media that has constantly, since the outset of this onslaught, tried to peddle Hamas and people like Sinwar as an obstacle to a ceasefire. But from numerous sources, especially Israeli media sources over the last 6 months that have leaked all the numerous attempts Netanyahu has conducted in order to torpedo any attempt at a ceasefire, diplomatic pressure is definitely going to be the thing that is needed, but not on Hamas. It's going to be needed on Israel. Netanyahu has proved that he is not interested in a ceasefire. Every attempt has been derailed from the Israeli side, something by, again, Israeli media's own admission. So if pressure is needed anywhere, it is on Israel now. Israel has kind of an escape route here where it can now claim some level of victory. It can claim that it has achieved at least one of its major military objectives here, which is the killing of the supposed mastermind. But we're not seeing that diplomatic pressure. We're not seeing any substantial pressure on Netanyahu to start now entering negotiations in good faith or in any serious manner.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, quote, Sinwar stood in the way of a ceasefire in Gaza. There is rhetoric since his killing to suggest that the responsibility is now on a weakened Hamas to accept a ceasefire. But it neglects two main points. One is that Hamas had already agreed in principle to a proposed U.S. plan in July that Israel later derailed and changed several times. And number two, the impact of Ismail Haniyeh's killing as the main Hamas negotiator on the ceasefire talks. How does Sinwar factor into the equation as an obstacle to a ceasefire?
Sinwar wasn't an obstacle to a ceasefire. Sinwar simply refused to budge from their position. So their terms had been put on the table, but they were unwilling to capitulate. That is exactly what the US and Israel wants. They want capitulation. They do not want negotiations. They want a full surrender. And that is something that someone as hardline as Sinwar was unwilling to provide. It's precisely why Hamas had selected someone like Sinwar. Now, when Israel had killed, I guess you could say, the last remaining moderate within the movement, someone like Haniyeh with that kind of influence, this was Hamas signaling that if Israel wants to play hardball, they can equally play hardball. And so they put someone like Sinwar at the forefront. And that's exactly what Sinwar was giving them. He was unwilling to bend to Israeli and US demands, which was, as I said, a total and complete surrender.
With him gone, has Hamas lost its leverage to negotiate its crucial demands? The release of the Palestinian detainees, withdrawal of Israeli troops, and the return of displaced Gazans to their homes. And what do you make of talks that Sinwar's body could be returned in exchange for the hostages?
No, this doesn't put Hamas in any position now to sort of cede to Israeli demands. I mean, this doesn't really change their position from what it was when Sinwar was around. I think, if anything, this has pushed Hamas into more of a corner, because anyone who's going to come, whether it's a pragmatist, a moderate, or a radical, is not going to be in any position to capitulate. At this point, it would be suicide for the movement politically. After everything Gazans have incurred, half of the territory is now effectively reoccupied. They've lost substantial chunks of their old leadership. And I don't think we've seen any indication from Hamas that they are willing now to sort of accept anything beyond what has been asked for back in July under the US brokered attempt. In regards to the idea of exchanging Sinwar's body for the hostages, I mean, I wouldn't really make much of it. I don't think this is something that necessarily Hamas would engage with, simply because I don't think Hamas are really using the hostages at this point as a significant playing card, but it is still a playing card for them.
You mentioned that Hamas is staying quiet for security purposes about who a successor could be. Do we have any idea who that person could be?
The most likely candidate is probably going to be Al-Hayya. I think Khalid Mishal himself has, from what we've heard from within Hamas, is reluctant to take the position of leader of the movement right now, given Israel's rampant campaign of assassination of its leadership. The question is, who is going to be the main liaison person internally now, which is going to make, things a lot harder in terms of, communication, especially when it comes to talks, because now who are you going to communicate internally with? There is, again, a number of names that have been put forward, but it seems most likely that it could well be Yahya Sinwar's brother, Mohammed Sinwar.
What comes next will depend on what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy is in Gaza. Public statements from world leaders trying to gain momentum from Sinwar's killing to end the war have yet to bring about any change, especially as the reality on the ground seems out of sync with what Israel is saying it's doing in Gaza. I'm joined by Avi Melamed, former Israeli intelligence official and founder of the Inside the Middle East Institute, to try and understand exactly what it is that Israel is trying to achieve at this point. Avi, since the beginning of Israel's war in Gaza, Israel said its goal is to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities and infrastructure. It has killed prominent figures in the group like Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Yahya Sinwar last week, destroying tunnels, killing fighters, closing the border with Egypt. All of that indicates that Israel is on one specific path. However, right now, Israeli sources are saying, and what we're seeing on the ground in northern Gaza, is Israel planning on turning the north into some sort of military zone. What is Israel's military strategy inside Gaza right now?
To the best of my understanding, Israel is now concluding set of operational military operations in the end of the day that are supposed to be the base to ensure two major things. One thing is to ensure that Hamas will not be able to rebuild its military power, and the other thing is that will be the beginning of scaffoldings that will enable regional players, backed by the international community, to start taking responsibility of the rehabilitation of Gaza Strip. I don't think that this is a long-term per se. I think that at some point we will see, and I hope that will be the case, we will see that there is a beginning of effort, of a parallel effort to start moving towards the building of those scaffoldings that I was talking about. This is, I would say, the short and the mid-term. I would expect, I think that during this short and mid-term, we could expect still the presence of Israeli military operations in a lower scale or in a lower volume. Of course, the long term has the other components that we talked about that will see a regional envelope. It consists of major players in the region like the Saudis, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, that has the abilities to come forward and to be proactively involved in the rebuilding of Gaza, and not less significant, in basically backing up the emergence of a Palestinian power that will rule, that they basically will be responsible for the people of Gaza.
Israel is preventing the entry of aid to Palestinians. Israel has a responsibility to bring that aid in. The US has told Israel that if you don't do better, then we're going to shut down your supplies of weapons. Do you think that Israel has a responsibility to bring in more aid? We have only seen 797 aid trucks enter Gaza this month. And that's just a bit more than what used to enter in a single day before the war.
From a humanitarian perspective, I have no doubt that currently Israel has to provide all the needs of the Palestinians, the civilians in Gaza, and to do its utmost efforts to make sure that the difficult conditions the Palestinians in Gaza are now experiencing will be as limited as possible. The conditions, the difficult conditions. So, of course, there is a responsibility of Israel to make sure to provide the Palestinians in Gaza Strip with humanitarian aid and all the things that they need. I told you, and I'm saying it very clearly, I have no joy to see innocent people and kids that are basically suffering from such conditions. And I think that most of the Israelis share my same opinion.
As you know, there's a power vacuum right now. So arguably, Hamas doesn't rule the Strip anymore. And its military leaders have been eliminated. There is nothing to rule in Gaza anymore because there's no infrastructure left. So right now, wouldn't you think that it's the prime time, and even a few months ago, for an actual negotiation, a discussion to be had over what happens to Gaza if the goal really was to just remove Hamas from power?
Yes, look, I agree with you. I mean, this is a point of time where potentially, I think, professionally, from my perspective, it's a good time to start moving towards the diplomatic channel and towards the non-violent channel. But who exactly is going to take over Gaza Strip? What's the mechanism that is going to be established to make sure that Hamas will not restore its power within months, including weapons, including control over the society?
A year of war and mass destruction has radicalized, definitely, little boys who've lost their fathers, even the women maybe who have lost their children. As you know, the civilian death toll is incredibly high. So isn't that something that Israel needs to consider in Gaza?
You know, following the elimination of Yahya Sinwar, some people, Palestinians and other Arabs, are saying Yahya Sinwar was the symbol of the resistance. He was the one that was fighting the enemy to the last breath, throwing a stick on a drum. In other words, there are voices within the Palestinians and Arabs that, in spite of the destruction that Hamas has inflicted upon Gaza Strip, there are voices who still view Hamas and the disaster it brought on the people of Gaza and romanticizing it and idealizing it. And then there is an opposite narrative in the Arab world and the Palestinian world, which basically says this person Hamas, this person Sinwar and Hamas dragged the Palestinian people to the biggest catastrophe ever. I'm looking to the future, and this is my question. Will the Palestinian take the road of let's praise and glorify and romanticize somebody that destructed our own people, meaning somebody like Yahya Sinwar, or let us take lessons. Let us really calculate where do we want to go. And by the way, not less than that, I think that this is a process that has to take place within Israeli society. Some Israeli right-wing politicians are talking today about re-establishing Israeli settlements in Gaza Strip. To the best of my understanding, most of the Israelis, overwhelmingly most of the Israelis, reject that.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This episode was produced by Rakan Abdelrahman and Ban Barqawi with additional help from Mahmoud Rida, Juman Jarallah, and Adel Ibrahim. It was audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir.